Total War Three Kingdoms is out and in full swing, and one of the main things that it has brought to the table is the much heavier focus on characters, and I wanted to see which of the champion class heroes was the best duelist. After all, champion class heroes are defined by how strong they are in one-on-one combat, so the best duelist among them is more relevant than it would be perhaps for the other classes of heroes that are available. However, it's not quite as cut and dry as just pointing them at one another and having them fight, because there is quite a lot of variation that can happen within these duels. Weapon selection, armour, abilities all come into play, and you might not even get the same result if you run the same battle again. So I've had to sort of take an average of what's been going on here and then make an assessment based on the 6 unique champion class heroes that there are in the game to see which is better at dueling. So, with this in mind, I have gone with a point scoring system. Each hero would face one another in battle, and for a win they would receive 1 point, for a loss they would receive -1, and in the rare occasion that the battle was too close to call and you would get a differing result each time and it was always very, very close, I would call it a draw and then there would be no points change at all. Although, with regards to the champion class heroes, this only happened once. In the event that 2 heroes have the same amount of points at the end, it would be decided by who won their personal duel, and if there was a sort of round robin effect going on where heroes would beat one another but they would all be on the same points, then I would take into account their performance overall against all the heroes to try and separate them. So, with that in mind, let's get right in at number 6. And interestingly enough, the first 3 heroes we go through all landed on the same points, all defeating one another, so I had to take into account their performances overall. And with that in mind, at number 6 we have ZHANG, the King of the Black Mountain. ZHANG is an aggressive fighter wielding 2 axes and sporting lighter armour overall than the majority of his opponents here. However, this lower survivability is probably what ended up landing him in number 6 on this list. As in comparison to his peers that were also on -3 points, he just didn't have the staying power when it came to facing some of the stronger champions on this list. In addition to that, his stats overall are actually lower than all of the other champions at the higher end. And indeed, his abilities were also not enough to save him. With some champions on this list, their abilities are so good that they are pushed up higher than they would otherwise have been just based on their base stats. ZHANG, however, is not one of these heroes. As with most champions, he does have an ability to deal direct damage in melee, however he also has one which is for lowering morale, which does not help you in a duel at all. And his final ability, which is his passive, is charge resistance, which does actually mean that more often than not ZHANG will be the one to dehorse his opponent at the start of the duel, but that's such a minor bonus that you get at the start of a duel, which is more than made up for by many of the other champions' passive abilities. Overall, ZHANG has really drawn the shorter straw there. Not to say that he's a bad duelist, of course all of the champions are very good duelists, it's just that ZHANG is not quite as good as the others on this list, to my mind. Even if he was able to pick up one win over another with regularity. And again, that comes down to a lot of the variation, the weapon choices can come into play there as well, so there is a good amount of variation. It's not impossible ZHANG could defeat anyone on this list, it's just generally speaking, ZHANG will find himself second best to most. So coming in at number 5 we have XIAHOU, the One-Eyed, and when you look at him next to ZHANG, he generally speaking has got higher stats, he's more survivable in melee. Also, when you compare the abilities, XIAHOU has 2 direct damage abilities compared to just 1, which you can use to great effect in duels. However, his passive ability is probably the most useless of all of the champions because it is missile resistance, ironically, of course, considering how he lost his eye. But yeah, this doesn't give you any sort of advantage in duels, of course, because ranged attacks are not going to be coming into it. Even so, overall, his dueling ability against others is what placed him above ZHANG, because actually he did lose to ZHANG with regularity. From what I was seeing. Armed with a spear, and perhaps that did play into it a little bit, perhaps the twin axes are just good against spear users in general. But yeah, XIAHOU, I guess you could say I was kind of disappointed. I was kind of expecting XIAHOU to place higher on the list considering his fame, and, well, infamy I should say, as a rather hot-headed general as they call him in the campaign. And also just in general I must say that I think if I were giving out points for style, XIAHOU would be the best looking champion. I really like his armour and his colour scheme. But overall his stats weren't anything to write home about. You know, there are other heroes on this list which have better stats, and his abilities were not enough again to make up for that. There are heroes on this list with stronger abilities which pushed them up higher, which is why XIAHOU was only able to achieve a score of -3 and not really stake a claim for getting into the top half of the list. Coming in at number 4, the final hero to achieve a score of only -3 is DIAN, the Loyal Bodyguard. Armed with 2 shortened G and sporting thicker armour overall than the vast majority of champions on this list, he is, when compared to the other dual wielders on this list, much more defensive in nature. All of his abilities are designed to make him last longer in melee or absorb arrow fire at range. Of course, that ability in particular, as we spoke about with XIAHOU, doesn't offer you any sort of advantage in a melee fight. However, he does have the ability to raise his melee evasion quite a lot, 100% in fact. His melee power is lower, again, just to sort of hammer home the fact that he is a little bit more about outlasting his opponent with his defensive prowess rather than dealing a lot of damage. Perhaps you could say he's the mirror opposite to ZHANG in that regard. However, he does have one of the more useful passive abilities, known as Cry of the Forest, which if his health drops below 20%, he gains a whopping 400% bonus to his melee damage base and armor piercing, which means when he's on his last legs, he fights at his hardest, which even if you're winning a fight against DIAN fairly comfortably, he can make a massive comeback in the late stages of the duel, which is ultimately what placed him above ZHANG and XIAHOU despite achieving the same score as them. Against the heroes that placed in the top half of the list, he performed consistently the best, and indeed it was rare, but he was actually able to defeat some of the generals in the top half of the list when I was running the tests, but it wasn't with any sort of regularity, and it did ultimately come down to a bit of good fortune on DIAN part, but it was nonetheless possible, which is what put him above his 2 compatriots down here in the lower half of the list. And it does also go to show how important these abilities can be, even the passive ones especially, because they can come into play consistently from a certain point onwards. And that is certainly what put DIAN at this point, because without that ability he may very well have come last. So, we'll move on to the top half of the list and all of the champions, which actually got into the positive scores. At number 3, with a score of 2, is what would have been my pick to win before I started running the test, GUAN, the God of War. And to be fair, GUAN is probably the most variable of all of the champions on this list because of one ability in particular, and that is, of course, his God of War ability, which is a melee attack which deals huge amounts of damage. However, you can only use it once per battle, and it can miss. You can miss with it, and if you do, you cannot use it again, whereas, of course, with most other abilities which deal more moderate sums of damage, you can use them over and over again as much as you would like. He does have a passive ability, but again, it's causing terror if you're winning in melee combat, which again, morale debuffing doesn't really come into play when you're in duels, because you don't break when you're in a duel, you fight to the death or you choose to manually run away, so not a particularly useful passive ability there, more useful in general battle. He does have another direct damage ability as well, which most champions have, Blinding Fury, which is a moderate sum of damage which you can use over and over, but GUAN's success in a duel can come down almost entirely to whether his God of War ability lands, because if it does, he can beat everyone on this list. Potentially. You know, some heroes can of course use their own abilities to even the playing field a little bit. Some of those abilities of course can be used more than once as well, whereas God of War is just the one and done affair. His stats overall are pretty impressive as well. His melee power is good, the joint highest on the list. His morale obviously is good. Melee toughness is decent. There are better on this list than GUAN at melee toughness, and that is perhaps why in general combat he has fallen short of gaining the top spot. However, again, your mileage will vary with GUAN. If God of War lands, there's very little that can stand up to him. But just the fact that it is only able to be used once and the fact that it can miss, there are other abilities on this list which are more reliable, I suppose you could say. And, you know, GUAN did lose with regularity to more than one person on this list, so the God of War only has to settle for the bronze medal on this occasion. Coming in at number 2, we have JIANG, the Bandit Queen, with a score of 3. And this took me a little bit by surprise because, on the face of things, JIANG and ZHENG are pretty similar in terms of what they're all about. JIANG does have the higher stats, so you would expect her to place above ZHENG, but the performances were very, very different. And Some of this can come down to the fact that, you know, the melee toughness of ZHANG is just a little bit higher. So unlike ZHANG, she's a little bit less of a glass cannon. Albeit, compared to some of the other champions on this list, she is still very much focused around aggression and dealing damage. Her melee power is only a little bit behind GUAN after all. Her abilities, however, are what ultimately pulls her through. One of her abilities is Poison Blade, which is, you know, not really relevant here because it cannot be used if you're in a duel, and it's also a missile attack, so again, not really of use here. Binding Fury, however, again, is just the same ability which most of the champions have to deal a moderate amount of damage, but it is her passive which sent her up to number 2 on this list, which is Tenacity of Steel, which is effectively the longer ZHANG is in a fight, the stronger she becomes. You know, after each phase of 15 seconds, she gains a buff to her melee damage base and armor piercing. This is similar to DIAN's ability, albeit at the highest end it is only 100% rather than the 400% that DIAN gets, but again, ZHANG doesn't need to be on her last legs for this to be in effect. She just needs to be fighting for a certain amount of time, and it's not a huge amount of time she needs to be fighting before it does get to the highest level, and when it does, ZHANG is very, very lethal indeed, capable of defeating GUAN, and yeah, it's a strong ability, Tenacity of Steel. It's the sort of thing that you actually see on some Sentinels to make them a little bit more damaging, because of course Sentinels are more focused around survivability. To put it on a champion, however, is very substantial, because of course champions deal more damage overall, and this can make them very, very lethal indeed. So ZHANG able to get up to number 2, but there is one who is able to defeat all the rest here. At number 1 we have XIAHOU, who is perhaps somewhat derogatorily referred to as the Tiger Fool, but there's nothing foolish about the way he fights, because overall he achieved a score of 4, which I decided to make it a draw between him and GUAN, because for the most part GUAN's God of War will land on XIAHOU, because he's a little bit less about avoiding attacks and just tanking them, which is not a great thing when it comes to trying to dodge GUAN's God of War. However, he was able to outright defeat everyone else on this list, and that came as a bit of a surprise, to be honest, because his melee toughness is pretty low. It's lower actually even than ZHANG's. His melee power is 10 as well, which again is not as high as some of the others on this list. His range toughness doesn't really come into it when it comes to duels. Morale doesn't either. However, there is a combination of things here which I think is what led to XIAHOU's overall dominance of this list. His abilities are all pretty good and all relevant for duels. For a start, we have Condemned Howl, which can only be used once, like GUAN's God of War. However, when his health drops below 50%, you essentially make yourself less tanky by dropping your melee evasion and armor by 100%. However, your damage from both base and armor piercing goes up by 900%. So obviously that's even much stronger even than DIAN's buff, which is able to really claw him back to achieve some victories. Very, very strong. Again, like God of War, it can only be used once, so that is an indication of how powerful it can potentially be. You also need to be careful with how you use it. You don't want to use it when you're at low health, because this is obviously going to kill you because of the amount of armor and melee evasion it takes off you. But if you use it just as you dip below 50%, it's enough for a huge damage spike. Also, Earth-Shattering Strike, which again lowers your melee evasion, which is to be expected when you're talking about someone who wields a hammer the size of the one that XIAHOU wields. Anytime you go for a big old swing with it, you're going to leave yourself a little bit open. Minus 100% melee evasion, but it also deals a decent amount of splash damage. Stronger, well, more splash damage than most of the other champion abilities outside of God of War, of course, and you can use this over and over again, but do be careful, it does lower your melee evasion. And then, of course, there's your passive ability, Stalwart Defender, which is, in effect, the whole time giving you plus 50% damage resistance. So XIAHOU could be almost looked at as a 5e barbarian, almost, with how he ignores 50% of all damage that's coming into him, which is good considering the fact he can't get out of the way of a lot of abilities which deal damage to him. But also, one of the things which I think gave XIAHOU the top spot was his choice of weapon. That giant hammer is very good for dealing armor-piercing damage, and while some of the others on this list don't really focus around their armor too much, it is still a big deal. You know, it's taking off a lot of defensive resistance that you may have, and XIAHOU is just capable of dealing out such big hits that no one else can really compete, other than, of course, GUAN with his God of War ability, but that's so variable, whereas XIAHOU has got a good amount of security with his abilities and the amount of damage he is able to deal, and the results don't really lie. XIAHOU was able to fairly comfortably defeat everyone on this list except for GUAN when he used his God of War ability. So, bit of a surprise here, I think. So that was the champion dueling list, and again, champions are all about that one-on-one combat, so it is very relevant to them who the strongest duelist is, and wasn't expecting those results, to be honest with you. I was expecting Guan Yu and XIAHOU to win to place at the top, but in the end it was not. It was Chu, the not-so-gentle giant. I think next I will be doing something similar with the Sentinels, so yeah, stay tuned for that. Hope you enjoyed this, hope you found it somewhat informative, but again, there is a certain amount of variation that can happen with these duels, and of course in campaign, when you give your men sort of different weaponry, it will really start to vary. This is of course using the pre-mades on the custom battles, where they have all of their unique gear, so do bear that in mind as you go forward. But yeah, hope you've enjoyed this, hope you found it somewhat informative, and I hope you will join me for whatever is next.